Hopefully I turned everything on. Oh, I did. Okay, good. Last time I did this, I didn't turn it on, so I didn't know how to do this right. It's an honor to be able to speak to you today. When Adam asked for someone to replace him because he was going to be gone, I said I'd be glad to do it either time, and I got this particular one. He assigned the passage for us for today, which was this Matthew chapter 2 passage. When I looked into the archives of my sermons, I'd been preaching for 45 years, so I had a bunch of sermons. I noticed that I'd never preached on this subject before. In my tradition, this is not something we focused heavily on. So I was forced to go back and re-study and revisit this passage again and try to understand what's going on there. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to look at this passage a little more deeply than I have in the past, and to share with you some thoughts that I have on the subject matter. I begin with a passage that comes out of Genesis, a story of Abraham offering Isaac. It's a story that means an awful lot to me, and it means an awful lot to me because the message of Abraham to Isaac is a message I find very deeply in this story as well too. As you recall, God had told Abraham to do something which was very uncharacteristic of God. In fact, God never ever would say this to anyone else again. God never ever asked for a human sacrifice, but on this occasion he told Abraham to take Isaac and offer him as a burnt offering to God. Now we know later on that it was a test, but at the time Abraham doesn't know this. And Abraham obeys God and begins to make preparation to go up to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son. In the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer understands the anguish that Abraham must have felt, and implies that Abraham must have envisioned that God intended to resurrect Isaac, even though at this point in time, as far as biblical history is concerned, resurrections have not occurred yet. We don't know that such a thing can happen. We don't know what's going on here. And yet he implies that Abraham must have imagined this because that's the only way God could have kept his promise that through Isaac, Abraham's promised blessing would occur. So on the way there, the story is told that Isaac, who at this time is probably at least a teenager, if not fairly older man, a younger man, probably old enough to be able to mangle his father in a wrestling match because his father's over 100 years old. Isaac says to his father, "Here's the wood, here's the fire, where's the sacrifice?" To which Abraham replies, "The Lord will provide the sacrifice." Now we know, because we know the story, that Abraham is thinking in his own mind, you are the sacrifice, but I'm not telling you that because I don't know how you're going to react to it. And doesn't realize that his words become rather prophetic, because as the story unfolds, God does provide the sacrifice for Abraham. And I find that phrase, and by the way, he will name the place afterward, the Lord will provide. That's how he names the place, because of what happens there. And I find a great deal of comfort just in the phrase, the Lord will provide. Because there's been times in my life, and perhaps times in your life, and you can identify with this, when it seems like the rug has been pulled out from under your feet, and you've been forced to ask the question, what's going to become of me? What's going to become of my family? How will we go from this point on? Those are questions that we've all had to ask sometimes, only to be comforted by the fact that the passage says, or reminded of the story, that the passage says, the Lord will provide. That God will take care of you. And sometimes it's a question, or it's a challenge to our faith to realize that that's an answer to our prayers. God understands what you're going through, and the Lord will provide. Now that concept is illustrated very deeply in this particular story we have before us today. Because we have the story of the young child, Jesus. We assume he's probably at least a couple of years old at this point in time. Has to flee to Egypt because of the danger of Herod going after him. I say a couple of years old because when the Magi come to Jesus in the story, they come to a house. They don't come to a manger. You know, in the story of the shepherds, they come to a manger because that's where Jesus has been born. But the Magi are following a star, and it's taken them time to get there. And when they finally find Jesus, they come to a house. Apparently, Joseph and Mary and Jesus have set up some kind of an arrangement where they're going to be living regularly there in Bethlehem. And as far as we see later on in the story, it seems like Joseph intends for this to be their home. This is where he was called back to for the census. He has family there, and so it seems like this is exactly what Joseph intends to do. The Magi, of course, as you know the story, had come to the place. They don't know where to go, so they come to Herod and say, "Where is the king of the Jews, to be born?" Herod doesn't know the answer to this, and frankly, he's a little bit shocked that there's another king out here somewhere. And of course, we know understand the character of Herod, that he is threatened by all this. Because he doesn't know, he calls for the chief priests and he calls for scribes to give him an answer. And they come before him and they give the correct answer. They know from the passage in the Old Testament, particularly from, I think it was Malachi. I can't remember where it was. I think it's Malachi. It was where it's in Bethlehem. So they quote it's in Bethlehem, and they give the correct answer. And so so he calls the Magi back. He says, "Go to Bethlehem and find this young king. And when you find him, then come back and tell me so I can go worship him too." It sounds like he has a devotion for this new king as well. Of course, we know there's an underlying thing going on with Herod. Herod doesn't have to do that. So the Magi come and they find Jesus, and they worship him, and they give the gifts to Jesus, which ironically will be something the family will have to rely upon on their time in Egypt. And so then the Magi are warned by an angel to not go back to Herod, and so they leave and they go back the way. Now our text picks up where the Magi have just left. So the Magi have left. And as the Magi have left, then Joseph has a dream. And in that dream, an angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "Don't stay here. Get up and leave, run now." And it's kind of an emergency thing. Get up now and leave in the middle of the night. Run for your life, basically, is what he's saying to Joseph. It's a threat it's there. The Herod intends to kill the baby and destroy you. So Joseph must wake up Mary and wake up the baby, and they must get themselves together, and they have to leave while it's still night. They have to leave at nighttime so no one knows what they're going on. They have to escape because their lives are in danger. This is a very terrifying thing. If you've ever had to leave quickly like that, you understand a little bit what's going on here. So they leave as quickly as they can and flee to Egypt. Egypt is only about 100 miles away at this point in time where they are. It represents a different kind of Roman province. Therefore, it's out of the jurisdiction of Herod. Herod can't reach them down there. Plus, there are many Jews who now live in Egypt at this point in time. So Joseph would not have difficulty getting lost in the crowd and finding a job and being able to make a livelihood down in Egypt while they wait for Herod to die. So we have this situation where they run to Egypt. Matthew then quotes from, is it Hosea? Hosea. I keep getting. I think it's Hosea 11. Out of Egypt I called my son. He's looking forward to as they will come out of Egypt. And here we have a very interesting comment, sort of a prophetic comment, where Jesus is, in his own life, living out the history of Israel. Adam has sometimes made this point as well, too, where Jesus is not only the Messiah, but he becomes the very essence of, in his own person, his own personality, his own personal life, a person who actually identifies with Israel itself. Israel's history is that they had fled down to Egypt for the sake of avoiding the famines and so forth. Eventually they would become slaves, and God would then call them out of Egypt. He said, "I call my son." And the passage that Hosea is talking about, he's talking about the Exodus of the Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament, God will mention the Exodus more than he mentions anything else as he talks. He will remind them that I called you out of Egypt. This is the single most important event in the Old Testament. It's a real big thing with God. He will always remind them that he called them, he brought them out of Egypt. So he says, I called my son out of Egypt. And Matthew is applying this to his son, Jesus, as well, because Jesus is living out exactly the history of Israel as he comes out of Egypt. So now we come to the question of the asylum that they're now in Egypt and they're waiting the time. Herod, when he hears about this, he becomes very angry. And so we see the character of Herod becoming kind of obvious what's going on. And Herod decides, because he'd already asked them exactly how long, when they saw the star and how long this is going, he then decides to have all the baby boys in Bethlehem killed. Historically, there is no mention of this reality anywhere in history. Even Josephus, the great Jewish historian who tells the story of the history of Herod, does not mention the killing of the babies in Bethlehem. We wonder why. What's going on? Well, to us, that seems like a big deal. Well, given the context of the time in which they lived, Herod tended to kill a lot of people. He killed many of his own family members as well as other people who he found who were a challenge to him or questioned his role as a king. He killed people all the time. And so killing the babies in Bethlehem wasn't such a big deal for them. Bethlehem at this point in time was a relatively small area. People have tried to estimate how many, given the infant mortality and given the surrounding, and how many people there were and how many infants usually lived and how many died. Infant mortality was a very big deal back at that time. They estimate at best that no more than about 20 young boys were probably killed. Just a small amount compared to the thousands that Herod would kill. So that may explain why it's not mentioned historically at all. But Matthew will make the point by quoting from a passage in Jeremiah about Rachel crying for her children. And in this passage, it's from Jeremiah. It's just as if he speaks of Rachel being resurrected from the dead and crying about the people who were taken to Ramah. When the Babylonians came, Ramah was this area where was the exit point. When they took people, that's where they started from. They started from Ramah, and they were led into captivity. So it says Rachel is crying for her children who are being deported. That's how the passage is talking about. He envisions that there's a feeling on the part of the ancient mother Rachel crying for her children as they're being led away into exile. It's a very, very sad story. God didn't ignore what Herod did. Sometimes humans dismiss something. Not that many. It doesn't matter. Not so important. It was important to God, and so it's mentioned in Jeremiah. And the prophet Matthew quotes this passage from Jeremiah. Herod finally dies, and an angel then appears in a dream to Joseph and says, "Go back to Israel." He doesn't say where Israel to go. Go back to Israel. So he takes his family, they come back to the land of Israel. Apparently, Joseph intended to go back to Bethlehem. That's where his family is. That's where they have a house. It seemed like that's what he would want to go to automatically. But the passage says, because Archelaus is now reigning, Archelaus is one of the sons of Herod, who's reigning in the place of Herod, he's afraid. Archelaus was also cruel like Herod. Archelaus would kill 3,000 people at a Passover riot one time because people objected him being the king in the place of Herod. So he's afraid of Archelaus. Plus, the fact is that you have some parents in Bethlehem who might remember that their children were killed, their sons were killed, and angry, they might look at Joseph and say, "You're the reason my child was killed. You snuck off in the middle of the night." And so they would probably raise the alarm. So he's in danger if he stays in Bethlehem because of the angry parents that might be around, and also because of Archelaus. So because he's afraid, he returns to Nazareth. And Matthew says that in Nazareth, that's where they would live. And he quotes, he says, the prophets claim he would be called a Nazarene. In the Old Testament, there's no Old Testament prophet that speaks of the Messiah being called a Nazarene. It doesn't exist. What's going on? Why does he say that? Well, to understand, you need to understand the context. Judea, generally speaking, the people in Judea despised Galilee. They despised Galilee because it was not near them. It was actually near what they would call pagan influences. There were people who were kind of a mixed breed up there, so they couldn't quite tell who all was what and what was going on. And besides, the people there often spoke more in Aramaic than they did Hebrew down south. And so sometimes they get the wording a little bit wrong, get mixed up. And plus, they didn't always obey the traditions up there in Galilee like they did down in Judea. So they tended to despise anything in Galilee. And then, too, there was a phrase they used back in that day and time to describe anyone from a low, unimportant, nothing important city. One of the apostles, a man who would become an apostle, would ask about Jesus. He would say, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That was an expression they had. When my brother died a couple years ago, the minister made a joke at the funeral. My brother was born in California. He would say, "Can anything good come out of California?" Kind of a political thing. But that's kind of how they think. Sometimes we pick up on these things and use it. To them, the phrase Nazarene was an expression, a libelous expression to describe anyone who came from a podunk little nothing town. Nothing was there. Jesus had no credentials. There was no school. If you were going to be raised to be the Messiah, you would think, be down there by Jerusalem, where all the brilliant, the smart guys are, where all the high priests are. And of course, we see a little bit of this in the story of Jesus when he's 12 years old, comes down, he wows them all because they can't understand how he can know this kind of stuff. Well, because that's who he is. But that's where the think tank was in Jerusalem. It wasn't in Galilee. So Jesus was from Nazareth. He's a Nazarene. He's a nobody. That's the situation. And really, the prophets that he's referring to isn't so much a particular prophet as it is the general idea of the prophets as a whole. Because the prophets would describe the Messiah as being despised and rejected of men. Jesus was despised and rejected because he had no credentials. One of the questions they would ask him, "Who do you think you are? Who gave you the authority to do these things?" That's the question they would put to Jesus. And one of his famous answers was, "I'll answer your question if you answer mine. And my question is, the baptism of John. What do you think about that?" And that really answered their question, but they didn't really want to deal with it. Was it from heaven or was it of men? Because it reflected on his authority. Am I from heaven or am I from men? Am I just making this stuff up? Or is there something unusual going here? Everyone who heard Jesus would say of him, "Wow, no one ever spoke like him. No one understood things like he did. No one grasped what he's talking about." That's the kind of character Jesus was. And so that gives us the story of Jesus. They come back, and so finally they come back to Nazareth, and Jesus will be called a Nazarene because he was despised and rejected. Now, the story of Jesus is very important because it causes us to respond to that in one of three different ways. There's three different ways in which people respond to the story of Jesus, and that response is even today, now in this day and time as well. The first way of response is the way like Herod responded. They respond with hatred and hostility. They don't want to hear about Jesus. They hate the idea of Jesus, and they don't want to have anything to do with Jesus, and they respond violently to it. Jesus said there would be persecution if you followed him. For many Christians, this is a real challenge for even being a Christian. Why should I be a Christian? Is there going to be persecution? Why would they do this? I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me to understand what God's story is all about. And the whole reason of the Jesus story, it's all about God loved the world, and God loved you, and God is overcoming your problem of sin by sending Jesus to deal with this problem. I can't understand why anyone would respond to it with hatred or hostility, but people do. One type of people who follow Jesus or who hear the story of Jesus respond with hostility and anger and hatred. A second group of people who try to follow, who hear the story of Jesus respond with complete indifference. This is illustrated by the chief priests and the scribes who hear the story from Herod and say, "Where is the Messiah to be born?" And they give the correct answer. "Why, it's in Bethlehem." But as far as we know, none of them go to Bethlehem to find out if the story is true. None of them want to find out what's going on with that story. And later on, when Jesus comes on the scene, they have a hard time listening to Jesus because he's not what they think he ought to be. They have a complete indifference to him. They don't want to listen to anything he has to say. There are people today who are the same way today. I've heard people ask someone, "Do you want to hear? Let me tell you about Jesus." I don't have anything to do with Jesus. I don't want to listen to him at all. Why? Because Jesus reflects something completely different than what I have no interest in that. There's a type of Christian that are called the C&E Christians, Christmas and Easter Christians. They only show up for Christmas and Easter. Otherwise, Jesus means nothing to them in their real life. We need to understand that Jesus intends to make a bigger difference in our life. It's not something you be completely indifferent about. Jesus matters. He completely changes your life. The third group of people is illustrated by the Magi, by the shepherds, and by Joseph and Mary. These are people who hear the story of Jesus and they respond with adoring, with adoration, and with love. They go out of their way, as Joseph and Mary, to put their lives at risk to protect the one who is the Messiah. They are willing to come and seek him out in the middle of the night, to seek him out, even though someone are trying to kill him. They're the ones who look for him and find him, and they want to adore him. That's what the story of Jesus is really all about. It's interesting that one of our Christmas songs, the chorus is, "Oh, how we adore him, we adore him." We should adore him. We should understand who Jesus is because we understand what he's really all about. He is the Son of God. He is, this was hard to comprehend, there is a God, and God is far above mankind. God is so far above mankind that mankind cannot even relate to God. But he loves us. And because he loves us, he then took upon himself human flesh. The incarnation, that's what we call Jesus becoming a human flesh. The incarnation of God is one of the most amazing miracles of all time because God becomes flesh. And as a human being, he has all the frailties, all the weaknesses that a human being has, and yet he's able to live the human life in a way that's unlike any human has ever lived that life before. And he demonstrates for us as he lives his life that yes, you can do it too. That's what the story of Jesus is all about. And God went out of his way to provide for us the message of Jesus. The Lord will provide. One of the aspects of my having broken ribs and having nothing to do is I had a chance to watch the 5th season of The Chosen, which is the story of Jesus. And in one of the stories, it showed the Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he has the prayer, "Let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but your will be done." And of course, the actor showing a great deal of agony and misery because Jesus is about to die. And one of the things they do as they tell the story is that they have Jesus then seeing characters from the past that somehow comfort him. And the first character that he sees is Isaac and Abraham. And Isaac asking Abraham, "Here's the fire, here's the wood, where's the sacrifice?" Abraham saying, "The Lord will provide." And that gave Jesus a great deal of comfort, at least in the depiction of The Chosen. It gave Jesus a great deal of comfort as he wrestled with the question, do I have to die? Why do I have to die? Please let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. As he wrestles with that personal agony, he's comforted by this message, the Lord will provide. That's a message that keeps resounding for all of us all the time. Not only in my personal life, but in your life as well. The Lord will provide. So much of the time, we miss the point when we live our lives and we experience losses, sorrow, or death. We miss the point that there's something more important than this life at stake. Jesus didn't come just to give you a better life in this life. That you have a better life, God bless you, that's wonderful. But not all of you will have a better life. Sometimes there will be loss. Sometimes there will be suffering. Sometimes the path of joy, don't know if you realize that, but as a Christian, you're walking a path of joy. The path of joy involves sorrow, loss. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. That kind of violates our mind. It kind of violates our thinking. How can you go to the cross for joy? Because he understands the outcome is not just in this life, It's beyond this life. The Lord will provide for your soul. The Lord will provide all that you need to bring you salvation. The Lord will provide what's best for you. It's illustrated in our story as the infant Jesus, where God is constantly interfering in the story by sending angels in a dream saying, get up, leave, come home. Don't go there, come home. He's warned by an angel not to stay in Bethlehem. So he must go because the angel tells him, as well as the various dangers we looked at before. God was involved in that story. And God is involved in our story as well, too. The Lord will provide. And that's something I hope we can all hold on to and remember, especially when we have hard times in this life. The Lord will provide for you. God bless you.